Now, there are a number of reasons given for registering voters. I have a very good friend who I've worked with around the world for a long time who says, look, voter registration gives you some idea or some points that feed into free and fair elections. But it also gives you a lot of other ancillary benefits. And you need to really look at all the things that you're doing if you're registering voters. The main thing, the main reason for looking at registering voters before an election is because it takes away that stress of having to determine both who's eligible to vote and who's eligible to get a ballot paper at the same time. That way it is a means of being able to reduce tension on polling day. It can assist controls on fraudulent voting. There's some that it can't assist, but things like personation, it can certainly help with. It can help with preventing multiple voting. There are others, of course, that it can't help with. I mean, it's very, very difficult for, without inking fingers, to stop people, the same person, from voting twice. It can assist in providing data for determining district boundaries. It can allow you to calculate your voter turnout, fairly mechanical things. But what you need to make sure, and we always need to make sure, is that you can spend a lot of money on voter registration, you can spend a little bit of money on voter registration. The benefits you get from meeting these objectives have to outweigh the costs. And it's not just in financial terms, it's also in political terms, in terms of establishing the political credibility of the election. We have to be very, very careful that we don't use voter registration as a smokescreen, that we can put a lot of time and effort into voter registration and getting that right or getting that good or spending a lot of money on systems and neglecting some of the other parts of the election that are equally important. There are many countries that have run elections without voter registration. I mean, South Africa did it in 1994 and ran an election that was regarded as credible. It was a difficult one to organise because of it. And it's not something probably anyone would ever want to do here again. But there have been countries around the Baltic who have still, until recently, have not had any voter register and have been able to manage to run elections quite credibly. So we need to be clear on why we're registering voters. What are we getting? What are the benefits? Do they outweigh the costs? We also need objectives. Now we can have high-level objectives. Most electoral organisations now have strategic plans of which voter registration forms a fairly large part. These objectives need to be commonly supported by stakeholders. It's all very well for an EMB to go out and say, look, this is why we're registering, this is what we're trying to do with registration, but there has to be a common buy-in. People have to be fairly widely supportive of what it is it's trying to do. It's not just a technical process, it's a holistic process. Too often people concentrate on the technical objectives of voter registration. How do we get something that's up-to-date technically, that we can use the most up-to-date biometric processing on without thinking about the political and the administrative environments in which they are working. Need to have objectives for stakeholders. Which stakeholders in voter registration will perform which roles? It's not just the electoral management body or the institution responsible for implementing voter registration that has the role. And to think that roles will just accidentally fit together is something that is not probably a sensible thing to do. Specific objectives may focus on a number of issues, from the methods and targets, on outreach and education, procedural issues, improving services, developing partnerships with both institutions and stakeholders. Without these objectives clearly understood and without them widely accepted, there's a lack of focus in the voter registration process. It can go off the rails fairly easily. And it's important before it starts that the time is spent looking at exactly why people are being registered and what is the purposes for which people are being registered, and to get these purposes and objectives widely accepted. Now, principles for voter registration. There are a number of different principles that could be applied. I've tried to distill a few common ones. and we can talk about these later this afternoon. The main issue is to get some agreement, I think, today on what are the most important principles to be able to implement and what are ways in which they could be implemented. And this will then flow through to the other groups that are being held and the other parts of this process over the next 2 days, looking at things like sustainability, looking at things like role of donors, looking at how to choose methodologies. All these things have to be rooted in the principles that are having to be embodied within the voter registration system and the voter registration processes. Of course, they should be embodied in the legal framework. And of course, those people who have responsibilities for voter registration should be embodying that framework and implementing that framework as far as possible. Many people have a role in advocating for the legal framework. Obviously, electoral institutions as advisors to government on processes have a major role, but also CSOs and academics. The principles need to be based on basic principles of human rights. The right to vote, the right to be able to exercise a vote if you're eligible to do so is a basic human right. So the principles of voter registration